All right, so we're going to get going. We're waiting on Senator Portman, who's en route to the facility, to the event, but we're just going to get going so we can maximize the discussion here. So hello and welcome. This is a fantastic turnout on such a beautiful Friday day, but you're here to hear from two of our nation's representatives here, our senators here to talk about this particular event, an important public policy event. I'm Jason Barabas. I'm the director of the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and the Social Sciences. I'm also a professor in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College. We're delighted to kick off the discussion today of one of the most important public policy issues of 2022, but possibly the 21st century, and that is the war in Ukraine. The war is ongoing and we want to get into the policy issues, but before we do, I want to briefly acknowledge some of the people in the audience as well as some of our partners on this event. So we have with us today Dartmouth President and fellow alum Phil Hanlon and his spouse Gail Gentis. We also have New Hampshire State Senator Sue Prentice. Is right over there. Thank you for being here. And we also have New Hampshire State Representative Jim Murphy. I just met him earlier. There you go. Jim, thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. There are likely many other elected officials out there who I may have missed. I apologize, and certainly in our live stream audience. So we've got a packed house here, but I'm sure our numbers are almost equally as impressive online as well. Also, I want to welcome back to campus all the alumni who are in town for their reunions. In particular, and I tried to look at which reunion classes dates were overlapping with today, but I'm going to make a shout out to class of 1976, 1970. Look, maybe I should do this in more of a, you can whoop and holler and whatever was appropriate back in the day. 1976, 1977, 1978. Class of 1992. I was at Dartmouth College during that time. I'm a class of 1993, so we'll get our contingent out next year. Class of 1997. Class of 2006. Class of 2007. 2008. There's a few here as well. And 2017. Any 2017s? A couple here as well. I may have missed, there are a lot of Dartmouth classes that have reunions that don't overlap today. They might still be in the audience, so if there's anybody else there, welcome back as well. Good to have you here again. And I want to leave time for the event, so let me briefly introduce our distinguished guests. We have two key members of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I could fill all the time I have today with their accomplishments, but we want to let you hear from them. So let me just give you some highlights. Let me take them in the order that we're going to have them speak. The first is New Hampshire's own Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire. She was the first woman in U.S. history to be elected both as governor and U.S. senator. So that's. She served on the Senate since 2009 and is a member of the Senate Committees on Armed Services, Foreign Relations, Appropriations, Small Business and Entrepreneurship, and the Senate Select Committee on Ethics as well. She's also, importantly for this event, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Europe and Regional Security Cooperation. So we're very excited to have her. Just in the dramatic entrance is our second time. We actually timed this. This is with a jump onto the stage too.
Start. Nice to meet you. Yep.
So our other guest this evening is Senator Rob Portman, who many of you know. He's a Republican from Cincinnati and a 1978 graduate of Dartmouth. And I wrote that there are likely many members of the class of 1978 in our audience, including our board chair of the Rockefeller Center, Tim Harrison, is right here as well. So thank you very much. Senator Portman represents the Cincinnati area in the U.S. House for over 12 years before being appointed to serve as U.S. Trade Representative and then Director of the Office of Management and Budget. In 2011, Portman was elected to the U.S. Senate, and he is co-chair of the bipartisan Ukraine Caucus in the Senate. He was also a Rockefeller Center board member, and his entire family has been very generous and supportive of our programming. In fact, I saw Senator Portman just 2 days ago in Washington, D.C., in the Capitol with 25 to 26 Dartmouth first-year students who were there as a part of a Rockefeller Center program where we bring students to Washington, D.C. each summer. So he could not have been more supportive there. Both Portman and Shaheen have been active in shaping U.S. policy on Ukraine, including numerous visits to Ukraine, for each of them personally, spearheading billions in security support, as well as participation in many working groups. So you're going to hear more about that. Finally, I just want to introduce our moderator. Our discussion is going to be moderated by Victoria K. Holt, who is the Norman E. McCulloch Jr. and Director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. She joined Dartmouth in September 2021 with a background in public policy, leadership, and diplomacy. In particular, she served on Capitol Hill for several years, including the House Armed Services and Foreign Affairs committees, as well as legislative affairs in the State Department. So this is a great way to hand off this event to Tori, the director of the Dickey Center. She's going to set the stage for the event and also moderate the discussion. So let me turn it over right there. Thank you again so much for coming out to this event.
Thank you very much, Jason, and it's a delight to co-host this event with the Rockefeller Center. The Dickey Center is sort of its cousin. We focus on international issues and is famously named after John Sloan Dickey, whose charge was to Dartmouth students to understand the great complexity of the issues of the day and to feel that they had some agency to play a part in addressing them. One of his most famous things was to bring thought and political leaders to campus, so I can't be more delighted that we're co-hosting this event with the two senators we have on this stage. Certainly, Ukraine is on the mind of many of us. There are many on campus. Some come from Ukraine or Belarus or Russia. Others have traveled or studied there. But it doesn't matter exactly where you're from, whether you're from Europe, the United States, or Durham, New Hampshire. This has had consequences for all of us, whether it's humanitarian consequences with the high levels of displacement, the geopolitics, what it's done with our alliances and with Europe, or what it means for a rules-based international order. I can't think of a topic more timely. So thank you both for being here today. In a moment, I will turn to the two senators, but for all of you in the audience, we'll give them each a chance to speak. Then we will hand out, if you haven't gotten one yet, a card. So please write down your questions. They'll be collected by some students. And after we go back and forth with a bit of a conversation, we'll invite those questions to be handed to me and I will read from them. One last note, Senator Shaheen has a hard stop. She must leave by 6 p.m. So I'll ask you to stay in your seats at 6 p.m. to let her to leave. Senator Portman, you are staying for your reunion, so I can't protect you from an enthusiastic audience. So with that, I think, Senator, you'll kick off the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tori, and thank you, Jason, for that very nice introduction. And to all of you, it's so nice to be here in Hanover and to see all of you in person. We're still getting over COVID, as all of you know, so it's really nice to be able to do this in person and to be with my colleague, Senator Portman, who I keep trying to persuade to stay in the Senate. Don't you think he should? But I'll be brief in my opening remarks because I know what we really want to do is engage in a conversation. And one of the questions that I often get asked is why it matters to people in New Hampshire that we are supporting Ukraine. And I start by talking about the courage of the Ukrainian people because they are really defending democracy, not just for their own country, but for the rest of the world. And as Tori said, this is really about the rules-based international order that has been in place since the end of World War II. And what Putin has decided to do is to engage in this war in Ukraine that is brutal, unprovoked, that is part of his aspirations to, I use that term loosely, he's talking about himself as Peter the Great. He wants to recreate the Russian Empire, not just the Soviet Empire, but the Russian Empire of Peter the Great, and refuses to acknowledge that Ukraine is a sovereign country much less that it should have its own aspirations to be a democracy with the rest of Europe. So it's a challenge that we all need to get behind, I believe, because it is about whether we're going to allow Putin to be successful in undermining not just Ukraine, but that international order. It's about whether we're going to stand up for those other democracies. I can tell you, as a member of the European Affairs Subcommittee, I talk regularly with other European leaders, whether it's the Baltics, Eastern Europe. They are very worried about what Putin's next move is going to be if he's successful in Ukraine. So there's a lot of sacrifice right now for Americans and for the rest of the world because of this war. But I think it's worth it, because if we don't stop Putin now, then he is going to undermine that order. And for both our allies and our adversaries, whether it's China or Iran, they are watching very carefully what happens here. And if Putin is successful, you can bet it's going to give them a green light to do all kinds of things. So I think this is a really important conversation. I'm really pleased that so many of you are here and that I can join my friend Rob in talking about something that we've worked really hard on together. It's been a very strong bipartisan effort in the Senate, and you will hear that in our conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Senator Portman.
First of all, this is the most applauding crowd I have ever been in. I love it. And I love being here with my classmates and President Hanley, good to see you. Jason and I worked together with a group of Rocky students, and Jeanne, they asked me the toughest questions I've gotten from anybody, whether it's in Washington or back in Ohio. And one of the questions was, why is this in our national security interest? So I think Jeanne's answered it well. I would only add to it that there are other countries involved as well. This is not just about us. And we have managed to help lead a coalition that now numbers 42 countries that have provided military assistance. Others have provided economic aid. So it's a global effort, and really freedom-loving countries all over the world are stepping up, because sometimes my constituents think, why are we doing all of this alone? And in fact, we're not. And that's heartening to me. Vladimir Putin expected that he would divide NATO further and really divide the free world. And just the opposite has happened, of course. And you've seen where Sweden and Finland have now applied for membership to NATO, and we'll have a vote on that in the next few weeks in the United States Senate, probably. And Jeanne and I will be enthusiastically voting for ratification and trying to get our colleagues to do the same. And so it's been very interesting to see how the world has reacted. Has every country stepped up? No. I'm disappointed in some, of course, who have voted against us in the United Nations, us being the free world, I would say, and have stuck with Russia. China's reaction, I think, has been very discouraging, but not surprising. But we need to look at the fact that countries all over the world who share our values and our principles have stepped up to say, this is a fight worth taking on. When I was asked about the national security interest in the United States, I also thought about the fact that, you know, this is the war of our time. I mean, we in our generation really haven't had this kind of a situation. Think about it, it's the first land war in Europe in almost 80 years since World War II. And it's the first time that, for many of us, we've seen this kind of naked aggression. And it is interesting to talk to some of my younger constituents and these students of the day who really are just shocked by it. Well, I'm shocked too, but our parents' generation wouldn't have been. My dad was a World War II vet, and you know, they understood that in the 1930s what happened could be replayed again and again if we didn't have an international order to keep it from happening. That's the order that Putin and the Russians are trying to dismantle. Jeanne and I took the last congressional delegation. We co-chaired it into Ukraine before the invasion, and we have traveled various countries of the world together. In fact, Jeanne took me to Georgia about a year and a half ago.
The country, not the state.
Yeah. Would have been a lot nicer to have been in the state, on the coast somewhere. But it was tough because, you know, we saw there two provinces that Russia has taken and established essentially a military base on and pushed out all of the Georgians and violated every international agreement they had with regard to these two provinces. And so this is why the Georgians are desperate to be part of NATO. This is why all the countries in the region are desperate to stop the fight in Ukraine, because they think it's coming to them, and they may well be right. One thing we probably didn't learn as well as we should have from the 30s is when people like Hitler said things, we should have listened. And if you listen to what President Putin is saying, particularly with regard to expanding this conflict to other countries, if you were a Baltic country, say Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia, or Poland for that matter, or I was just in Romania and Moldova 2 weeks ago, you know, they all feel the pressure. They all feel as though they could be next. And they may well be next. So this is not, again, just about Ukraine. Also, I do believe we have a certain commitment to Ukraine. And it dates back really to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. Some of you are aware of it, but the media doesn't talk about it much. But this was an agreement that was made after the wall came down with Ukraine, which said, basically, we'll guarantee your territorial integrity in exchange for you getting rid of your nuclear weapons. Remember, Ukraine was a country after the wall came down that had its own nuclear arsenal. And Ukraine agreed to destroy their nuclear weapons and their nuclear weapon capability in exchange for this guarantee of protection by 3 countries. Russia, how'd that go? The United Kingdom, and us. So we have to recall that, and I think we should take our international commitment seriously. And then finally, the Ukrainians have decided again and again since that time that they want to be like us. They want to be free. They want to enjoy the prosperity of a free market economy. They want to get away from the corruption and the oligarchs. And in 2014, they did it most recently, and it was very explicit. And I was there in 2014. Jeanne was there probably at the same time as well. I was there as an election monitor for the first really fair election they'd had in decades. And at that time, on the Maidan, where they had 100 demonstrators killed by snipers who were on the roof, Russian-backed government, you know, the European Union flag was flying and the American flag was flying. And the country decided, we want to turn to the West. So I'm not saying that gives us an obligation to defend them against all comers, but it certainly means that if you believe in freedom and you believe in strong alliances and you have a country that has chosen to embrace us, that it's appropriate for us to embrace them. So that's one reason I've been so engaged. I've been to Ukraine, I think 8, maybe 9 times if you include stepping over the border in Moldova 2 weeks ago. And I do think it is the battle of our time. JFK was meant to give a speech that he never gave. It was on the day that he was assassinated, and he was to give it to the World Affairs Council in Dallas, and he said something like this, and I'm glad none of my history professors are here because I'll probably botch the paraphrasing here, but it was that at this time, in our generation, by destiny rather than choice, America is the watchman, watchguard on the walls of world freedom, by destiny rather than choice. I think that's part of the answer too, is why it's in our national security interest. We're not a country that looks to conquer other countries. We instead, over the years, have a proud tradition of liberating other countries, and I think of World War II in particular, but even since then, our objectives are pure. Our implementation isn't always perfect. Think Iraq, Afghanistan, but the point is, if not us, who? By destiny rather than choice, America is that watchguard on the wall of world freedom. So I do think that's something that we sometimes lose track of as well. It's been 114 days, and the American attention span is very short these days. And you probably can't find a story about Ukraine on the nightly news anymore. It was everywhere for the first couple of weeks of the conflict, and then even for the next couple of months. Now it's really waning. So part of what our obligation is, I think, Jeanne and myself, and we do it constantly, is to just keep the attention span on this very important issue so that Vladimir Putin doesn't have a victory, which would be to outlast us. And that's why last week we met 2 days ago with the leaders of the parliament, the Rada in Ukraine, who came to Washington to plead with us to provide more arms and a specific kind of weapon that we can talk about more later in response to questions. But they need the capability to be able to respond on a level playing field with Russia right now. They are losing between 100 and 500 troops a day because Russia can outdistance them with their artillery. And we have just, as of 3 days ago, made a commitment to provide some of those weapons. In my view, and Jeanne's view, not enough and not fast enough. But this will enable the Ukrainians to have a fighting chance in the Donbas region, which is where the battle is currently being engaged, where it's become an artillery battle as compared to what was happening in the Kyiv region or even Kharkov or other places where the Ukrainians were quite successful in almost a guerrilla warfare approach. Now it's larger weapons, heavier weapons. The Russians can sit back and fire on Ukrainian positions, killing civilians as well as soldiers, flattening cities, and the Ukrainians can't reach them, so they're firing with immunity. And the question is, can they get weapons from the UK, from the United States? And we've now begun to provide them. They should be there next week, we're told. It enables them to reach those Russian positions and have a chance to keep Russia from making the incremental progress that they're now sadly making in the Donbas. So that's the current state of the kind of our military concerns. With that, again, thank you all so much for being here. I expected 10 students and maybe a couple faculty members and walked into this great, great crowd. So, Tori, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much. So in a moment, I'll ask you. In a moment, I'll turn to the cards from the audience. I think a colleague of mine will come and magically hand them to me on stage. I can't see him, but you're out there. So let me ask you perhaps a follow-up question. You both have really made a case that this is a consequential conflict. The Russia's invasion has really violated the principles of the international order. And I'll just note, they didn't even make a case as a member of the Security Council to their colleagues, whether it was abuse of the Russian-speaking population, the potential for proliferation of nuclear weapons, or disagreement with Minsk. Because I think that's a well-argued point. But take us a little bit further into the future. You rightly point out that there's a coalition here, but General Milley was interviewed and said, well, Russia's regrouping in the east has really threatened a number of the cities. We're seeing the human consequences of this. The sort of unprecedented sanctions that were put together, do you think those will hold? Can we keep the alliance that's been built on this? And as the humanitarian consequences grow, to include food insecurity in other parts of the world, how do you advise us to think about this long game so that we do indeed treat this as the consequential conflict that it is? So any advice to us on how to think about that, and what you would see in addition to military assistance?
Well, I do think that's one of the big challenges, excuse me, is trying to keep the coalition together, as Rob said, but also to keep the publics engaged, because the coalition are democracies. Some of our countries are more functioning democracies than some of the other countries in the coalition. But as democracies, we respond to different pressures than obviously Vladimir Putin is responding to. And so I think that is one of the real challenges that we have. And as we look in both Europe and the United States at rising prices, particularly at the gas pump, the frustration that people feel about the impact of the war on those rising gas prices is going to increase. And so one of the challenges, as Rob says, is that we have, I think as elected officials, we have a responsibility to continue to talk about why this is important and why this matters for the United States and for our individual constituents. With respect to food, I think we need to think about whether there's a way to turn that issue back on Putin. Now, one of the things that the Russians are really good at is disinformation. We have not caught them on that front at all, despite a number of different initiatives. And one of the things they're doing is blaming the United States for the food insecurity that people are going to be facing, already are in parts of the world, but are looking at, particularly in Africa, where Russia's been very effective in saying it's the United States' fault. Well, I think we ought to think about how we turn that around on Putin. And there's some risk involved, but if the United Nations were to say to Putin, we are not going to let these countries in the world starve because you're a bully in Ukraine, we are going to take this grain out of the Black Sea and we are going to provide an escort and dare Putin to go after that. I think that would rally a lot of people who are really not sure who to blame for what's going on, and it would stand up to Putin in a way that may have some real opportunity. Now, again, there's some risk involved, and so getting agreement to do that is not easy, but I think we've got to look at where are there opportunities in this dynamic where we can change the tables, turn the tables on Putin, and really put him on the defensive, because so far, we've been on the defensive. Ukraine's been on the defensive, and we got to figure out how to reverse that.
It's a great point. Disinformation is something that the Russians are much better at than we are, and they spend a lot more money on it. And Jeanne indicated we do have some initiatives I've been involved with, she's been involved with, that are trying to help just to get the truth out. And yet, with regard to the grain issue, you may not have heard that the Russians actually bombed a grain bin near one of these ports, Black Sea ports, recently. 400,000 tons of grain was destroyed. I mean, food should never be used as a weapon of war, and that's exactly what they're doing. So they purposely are targeting grain bins. They also simply have to open up the Odessa port for the grains to be able to flow. So it's wheat, but it's soybeans, and it's sunflower oil, and it's other goods that are unable to leave any of the Black Sea ports, most of which are now in the conflict. Odessa is not yet controlled by the Russians, so the Odessa port is there. It's a huge port. But the Russians have indicated that, one, they've mined the ports. The Ukrainians, by the way, have mined the ports on the other side to keep the Russians from coming in. They're, of course, happy to sweep their mines in order to get the material out. And I think Jeanne's absolutely right. The Secretary General of the United Nations has been working on this. Russia has said they'll only do it if we get rid of the sanctions on Russia. So pretty hardline position. But to Tori's question about the sanctions, I actually believe that we have an opportunity to increase the sanctions where they really hurt, which is energy. And right now, as you know, the Europeans are still relying on Russian energy, particularly gas and oil. They've agreed by the end of August to cut off coal supplies, but it's roughly $870 million a day that is going to Russia to support the war effort. And the margin on that, the profit on that, is very large. So this is what's funding the war. And it's true with Russia's budget generally. Long before this invasion happened, 40 to 50% of their budget was energy receipts, their revenue in their budget. So they've always been, as John McCain once famously said, it's a country masquerading as a gas station. But it is outrageous that we, in essence, in the West, are funding this, but the Europeans find themselves in a very difficult position because they've become so reliant on fossil fuels from Russia over time. So in Germany, it's roughly 40% of their oil, for instance, and they're experiencing the same thing, which is global inflation for lots of reasons. We won't need to get into this debate, but I would argue that if you look at our gas prices, they started to go up long before there was any invasion. So to blame it on Putin is not necessarily accurate, but for a lot of people, Jeanne's right. This is a very sensitive topic right now. It's the topic. So my hope is that we can provide some alternative through liquefied natural gas, which actually would be a cleaner source of fuel than the Russian oil, and that other countries will as well. So Qatar just agreed to provide liquefied natural gas. Israel is providing some through Egypt. They've just announced that in the last couple of days. So other countries are stepping up in addition to the United States. And so there is an alternative here for the Europeans. And so they're saying that by the end of this year, they hope that they can largely be able to cut off their supply of oil and gas from Russia. We'll see. We'll see. But it is, to me, the single most important sanction. This week, our own government decided that we were not going to require that U.S. banks enforce a sanction on energy transactions until December, so we put it off till December. And again, it's in response to the global price increase and the sense that, you know, if we were to do that, it would hurt the European economy even more. On the other hand, again, this is counter to what we were all sort of told by our own government, that we were going to put tough sanctions in place on our banks, and we're making an exception for energy transactions with Russia. So to me, that's where we have the most opportunity. So I understand some of the sanctions may be difficult to maintain over time, but actually the energy sanctions, which are the most important ones in my view, should increase over time. And by that, I do think the Russians will begin to feel it much more. Right now, their economy is down somewhere between 10 and 15%, they say. The Ukrainian economy is down 47 to 50%. So, I mean, the Russians aren't feeling all the pressure they should be feeling, and it's primarily because this flow of energy continues.
Well, thank you very much. So let's get some questions from the audience here. I think my colleague is about to hand me some. Looks like a thick stack, and I know we have limited time. All right. Thank you so much. All right. Okay. This says, I'm a Dartmouth of 21, fighting in Donbass. There's been huge emphasis on disparity between Russian and Ukrainian firepower, but little about the needs of individual soldiers here, navigation goggles, night vision goggles and thermal systems were necessary to operate at night. Are Western offenses aware of this? Are they trying to solve this problem? Wow, that's a quite specific question. I don't know if either of you, it's a very detailed question about specific capabilities, including night goggles. It sounds like a Dartmouth graduate from 21 is serving now in Ukraine.
Wow.
Well,
Okay.
that must have, thank you for the question
Yeah. Whoever.
and for your service.
Yeah.
It's live stream
Wow.
as well.
Oh, it's okay. Wow. That blows me away. So there are probably 10 to 20,000 Americans who are over there. That's not a classified number because I don't know. I'm just making it up. No, I've been told that by various sources, but not in a classified setting. And these are 10 to 20,000 Americans who just not a lot, some of them, I will say, are Ukrainian Americans. Some are from my home state of Ohio, I happen to know, who have just gone. And they're signing up, and they're helping, particularly with regard to training. So we just announced that we're going to provide some additional equipment to Ukraine, and that includes these longer range missiles, as we talked about, but also it includes some of the very equipment that he's talking about. Night vision goggles is something we have provided in the past. I don't think it's in the latest tranche, but that's helpful information. More security vests, Kevlar vests is part of the package. By the way, from Ohio, our law enforcement agencies all across the state of Ohio are donating them. And that just overwhelms me. I mean, we have a lot of Ukrainians in Ohio, but we also have a lot of people who really want to help, and including these law enforcement officers. What was the other thing you mentioned?
I think you've covered it, and I will hand this note to you later. It was
Yeah, I'd love
about
to.
basically goggles and thermal capabilities, and are Western officials aware of these sort of problems in the field? So.
Yeah, would love to communicate with that person if you can get the
absolutely, we can
information.
follow up.
And just to add a couple of things to that, you probably heard the news reports today that there are 3 Americans who have gone missing in Ukraine. 2 the Russians have captured, and 1 person who has been missing since the end of April. And one of the things that we've seen in New Hampshire, as you have in Ohio, is a lot of citizens who want to help both on the humanitarian side and with things like the Kevlar vests. And we've had a number of plane loads from here that have gone over to Poland and then into Ukraine. So that's an effort that I think is really commendable, and some of you here may be involved in some of those efforts that are really making a difference. And we had the opportunity to raise concerns with various members of our federal agencies about the difficulty that some citizens have had in trying to get that assistance to Ukraine, and so they've been trying to better help cooperate with local citizens who want to do that.
Great, thank you. So this question, it seems one that many in the audience would have. As a matter of lines on a map, what is the goal? Is it Ukraine's February 2022 borders? Is it Ukraine's 1991 borders? And if it looks like Putin will indeed conquer the rest of the East or even further in the areas beyond Donbass, is the policy going to change to prevent a risk of a greater war with Russia? So there's many ways to interpret that, but it's a good question about where we go from here. I don't know if either of you would like to take that one.
I think the goal here is to have a situation where Ukraine can determine their own future. It's not up to the United States to say to Ukraine or to the allies to say to Ukraine, you have to decide to give away the Donbass region of your country to Russia. Now, they may decide to do that, but I think the goal is for us to support the country so that they can make their own determination about their future. And that's part of what this whole war is about. It's about making sure that countries can determine their own futures. And Ukraine wants to look west, they want to be a democracy, and Russia should not have the ability to come in and say to them, no, you can't do this.
Yeah, it's a very tough question, and when we met with the parliamentarians this week, one of them made an interesting comment. He said that he was a negotiator with the Russians early on, and that on the table at that time was a proposal that, depending on what the Russians did, perhaps the end point could be the pre-February 24th lines. And his point was that at this point, after tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been killed, cities have been flattened, hospitals, schools, office, churches have been bombed, there's not a lot of interest among the people of Ukraine to make any concessions. And so to Jeanne's point, they need to chart their own future, and we are there to support them, as are, again, many other countries in the world. But there's a hardening of a conflict when you see the horrific atrocities that have been committed, including many cases of war crimes as defined, and some are being prosecuted now, but the murders and the rapes and the torture, and so it's going to be very difficult for, Jeanne mentioned a democracy versus an autocracy and how decisions are made. You can imagine how the people of Ukraine feel about this conflict now and feel about Russia, and they're not in a mood, according to this parliamentarian, which I certainly understand, to make any concessions.
That's a great lead into another question from the audience, which asks, in your view, how big a role has misinformation played in aiding Putin's invasion? And how do we combat subversive statecraft? I think in we, it's probably in the sense of democracies. You both have briefly touched on this. It's a tough question, but I welcome any insights you have. How do you combat misinformation? Or I would add disinformation as well.
Yeah, I think the real question is the disinformation. This is a deliberate effort to mislead people about what Putin is doing, and we've seen it here from the 2016 elections to what's happening in Ukraine. And it's really hard as democracies, and for us, not just because of the difference in how decisions are made, but also because we have a First Amendment here in this country. And it's really hard to think about how we respond to that kind of disinformation. I mean, obviously getting the facts out, but one of the things I remember is we had General Breedlove, who was then, I think, the head of Central Command in Europe when the plane was shot down over Ukraine after the invasion of Crimea. And I can remember him testifying before the Armed Services Committee and saying, we knew within 2 days who shot that plane down. It was the Russians. And it took us 2 years to convince the world that that's who did it. And so we've got to think about, and of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we dismantled all of our apparatus for Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Now we're rebuilding that, but it's a long-term challenge. And so we are not doing what we need to do. We need to have somebody in charge across various agencies within the federal government, I believe, who is going to coordinate these efforts. Right now we have the Department of Defense that does some things, the State Department does things, and they talk to each other. But there isn't a coordinated response in the same way that Russia in particular does their disinformation.
I think that's very, very good points. I want to add two things. One, you recall that as the invasion approached, the United States was providing information to our European allies and to the Ukrainians and to the world about what was happening. It was highly unusual. We were taking very sensitive, highly classified information and declassifying it immediately, which was not something that our intelligence agency was very comfortable with, to be honest with you, whether the Defense Intelligence folks or the CIA or others. But the thought was, let's respond to the Russian disinformation. Remember, they were saying, no, we're just kind of here for a camp out, or, you know, we're invasion? What invasion? We would never do that. You know, these are our neighbors and fellow Slavs. And we knew otherwise because we could tell by the, you know, when you have blood banks being built up along the border, something's going on, right? And the kind of military, the kind of heavy weaponry. So we just went public with it. And I think that was very effective. And I've been very appreciative to our administration on the intel side for doing that. So I think that is something we've learned.
I agree.
In this battle is just when they lie and say things that aren't true, to the extent we have intelligence, declassify it and show the photographs and let people see the transcripts of a communication. So more transparency, I think, is one answer. The other is, not to get into the weeds here, but there's something called the Global Engagement Center, GEC, at the State Department. This is what I mentioned earlier. This is an initiative that Jeanne and I and Senator Murphy and I founded this, I don't know, 4 years ago. Our idea was to try to get the United States to coordinate better, and we've never funded it properly, in my view. We don't have a leader for it. There's not a director right now, and it's too bad because this should be that organizing entity, and a lot of it would be providing grants and help to NGOs in countries where there is not a tradition of freedom of the press, to encourage that, and to help journalists in places like Russia to be able to survive and to tell the news. It also works in conjunction with these entities like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, and I've gone to visit their headquarters in Europe to make sure this is all synced together better. But Jeanne's absolutely right. You know, we kind of left all that apparatus behind, thinking the Cold War was over. We were going to spend the Cold War dividend. Everything was fine. Russia would never do this again. And here we find ourselves in a very different situation. So we're outgunned in that sense too, in that they have a lot more money and effort put into this, online in particular. But we are trying to have a better coordinated effort and trying to increase the funding for that, so we can be more effective at just getting the truth into these countries. It's amazing when you look at the polling in Russia. Of course, I don't know if I trust it. You know, if I were to ask you, do you support the war in Ukraine? You're kind of looking around, yes. Yeah, I mean, so I don't necessarily trust the polling, but it's very discouraging, indicating that the saber rattling that Putin is doing and the Peter the Great utterances and things like that are apparently being accepted, including lies about Ukraine and denazification. These parliamentarians who came, you know, here you have a Jewish head of state in Zelensky, and whose family was in the Holocaust, and somehow, and Jeanne and I again have been there a lot, and we've talked to the civil society folks. It's all just total BS. It's not true. None of it's true. But the Russian people, unfortunately, are not getting the other point of view, because state-owned media is now controlled, and they're not allowing the information in, even sometimes jamming and blocking internet communication, which has always been what I thought was going to end up being the answer, both in China and Russia and North Korea and so on. Who can stop the internet? Well, it turns out people can stop it, and they're doing it effectively.
Well, I'm going to have to bring this to a close. A question I didn't get to ask from one of the members of the audience is, what more can we all do? And I think you've already touched on it. And thank you for looking behind the headlines and telling us why this is such a critical issue, giving us some very concrete ways of thinking about moving forward, and perhaps we can invite you back for a continuation of this conversation. So please join me in thanking our guests and letting also Senator Shaheen leave.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Rob, thank you. It was fun.
Anytime you come to Dartmouth, you'll get applause like this.
Do you want to go this way?
Okay, Senator Portman told me anytime I come to Dartmouth, you're going to applaud like that.
Thank you so much. Do you want to stay and ask?
Sure. So just one point on energy that I missed last time, because I just see my classmate Dan Reichert here. And one of the things that Dan is working on is providing an alternative to our European allies who receive this Russian energy in terms of a more effective way to use renewables and other greener energy. Now, they're already sort of down that path, but there are ways we can help there too in terms of energy efficiency, certain technologies like hydrogen. So this is an opportunity in a way. Not sure Europeans are going to view it that way as their prices go up when they lose access to this Russian oil and gas, but it's an opportunity both to provide liquefied LNG and to also, find other ways, and all of the above approach in effect, to be able to counter this dependency on Russian sources. And I think, Dan, you said Stanford's going to do a study that I may be interested in helping on.
If the audience would like to stay for a little bit, I could ask one or two, sir, if you have a moment.
I'm fine, but people have cocktail hour next, so
Oh, dear. Okay.
I'm between them and a beer, but sure.
So we'll stick to two. One maybe lets you answer the question I was hinting at, which is what can an engaged public do? Like give money is one option, be involved. Is there anything else you might advise to this highly educated, very interested audience?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there are so many groups doing great work in Ukraine, and you can go online and find that. I know Dartmouth probably provides some of that, Phil. I don't know if you have any specific student organization that's been helpful in this regard.
We do. We have some guys on, and we're offering admissions to Ukrainian students.
Offering admission to students from Ukraine. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. There's one group that I love. It's called World Central Kitchen. You've probably seen Jose Andres, and he's quite the showman, but he's also doing a really good job. And I volunteered at one of his World Central Kitchen kitchens in Poland along the border, and I spent 2 hours, providing food to refugees, and it was just so uplifting. And he's got now over 100 of those kitchens around Ukraine in various places. In fact, he's had some of his volunteers injured through Russian bombing of these kitchens as well. But they're doing a good job, and it's almost all private donations. In fact, probably 95% private donations. So Jane and I have supported that because I know what they're doing. They're doing great work. And then we've got some Ukrainian groups in Ohio who are doing great work. So if anybody's interested, our website has some information, our official one, but talk to me here in the next couple of days. There's plenty of great groups that are actually on the ground doing really good work. As Jeanne indicated, New Hampshire, I'm sure your state's doing it too. I think that's one thing. And the other thing is just to keep the awareness up, to let people know, if you agree that this is a challenge for our time. This is sort of where the fight for freedom is being engaged today, and we have to keep people's attention on it and understanding that this is not going to be a short-term solution, because I believe that President Putin and the Russians are committed to sort of a frozen conflict here and just continual fighting. You think about it, really, this has been going on for almost 9 years, because going back to 2014, remember they took Crimea with no bloodshed, but then with regard to Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbas region that they had, there has been a conflict. I've been to the line of conflict, and I've had to duck, because there are Russian snipers shooting at Ukrainian soldiers, and they did kill, about 14,000 of them in the last 8 years. So this is not new, and my concern is that this will just continue, to answer the earlier question, except taking even more territory. And so we have to be patient and continue to be willing to help.
Thank you. That was pretty much the last question, which is what does this mean for our relationship with Russia and with other nations that Russia allies with? Where does this go? Does this also lead to a stronger NATO? Do you think that Turkey will allow its expansion, particularly with the new countries that wish to join, Sweden and Finland.
I certainly hope so. I mean, the Article 5 commitment under NATO, which is the mutual defense, where the United States has made a commitment with regard to a couple dozen countries. Hey, if you get attacked, we're going to come to your aid. And by the way, vice versa. We have a little bigger army than most of them do, but they would help us as well. That's never been tested. And so we've got to be sure that as we expand NATO, the countries really have that commitment. And I believe that Georgia and Ukraine, which are the two countries that would like to join now, certainly have the commitment. Ukraine, by the way, has shown itself to be incredibly capable on the battlefield. It's the bravery and the courage and this sense of defending your homeland and your family that has given them that spirit. But also, they're just good fighters, and we helped train them along with other NATO allies over the last 4 or 5 years. And they've been at our side in Afghanistan and Iraq, so we know them, and we knew that they were good fighters. Our military didn't know that they could withstand the onslaught, I will tell you that. Both President Putin and our own military thought this will last about 4 days, maybe a week. And when we were a week into it, and I was making my pleas, provide more help, they said, well, gosh, it's going to be over by next week. And then next week I said the same thing, well, it's going to be over by next week. So, they're exceeding expectations continually. But they will be an important part of NATO should they join, because they have a great military. Just as when the Finns come in, they're very good fighters. They have a great air force, as an example. So it'll enhance NATO's capabilities, which are purely defensive. I mean, the idea of NATO is to tell Russia, don't do what you're doing right now. If Ukraine had been a member of NATO, which they have tried to be, as you know, back in 2008, they were given a commitment they would become part of NATO, as was Georgia, at some point. If they were NATO countries, Russia would not be in there doing this. They just wouldn't. As crazy as Vladimir Putin seems to be, and he does seem to be illogical in terms of what he's doing, to take on NATO, which is a superior force in every way, number of troops, the kind of military equipment, even the nuclear arsenal that we have and France has in other countries, he wouldn't have done it. So I think they should be eligible, as they progress through a process. You start with what's called the MAP process, and getting into the EU, which is something the EU is now, the EU Commission just announced that they would like Ukraine to be part of the EU. That's the first step, in essence, because some of the NATO requirements are really more along the lines of the EU commitments also: democracy, transparency, lack of corruption, civilian control of your military, and so on. So I hope that that's the route that we will take. And I think that's really all that protects Ukraine going into the future. And for that matter, the other countries on the Eastern Front.
All right, well, thank you for taking a few extra minutes
Thanks,
with
Tori.
us in the
Thank you all.
audience.